777 millimeters of mercury, 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 777 $4.99. Okay chat, we messed up on the pizza, so I will take 5 of you to Chuck E. Cheese for some pizza and games. Line up so I can choose 5. Oh, in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. $777 millimeters of mercury, 777 millimeters of mercury, 777 millimeters of mercury, 777 millimeters of mercury, 777
All right, I'll be back.
mercury, 700.
National, who is hosting the event on YouTube for those afraid of the Twitch platform, and finally politics.gg Discord, where they are hosting the debate of the debate because the internet is constantly trying to out-meta itself. The rules are very simple. Both participants have agreed to approach this conversation in the best of faith. We'll be giving 3-minute opening statements in which they will both give defense of their arguments. This will be followed by a girthy hour-long open forum between the two of them, followed by a 20 to 30-minute audience Q&A, and finally closing statements. If you'd like to participate in any point in the audience Q&A, please head over to twitch.tv/thesearchtv and hit !debate in the chat. There will be a link to a form you can fill out. that will be made available. While donations are always appreciated, please be aware donating does not mean that your questions will be read. The only way to participate in the Q&A is going through the Google Doc form that we have provided. Finally, we will ask that everyone in everyone's respective chats please avoid the use of anything that would either violate Twitch or YouTube's terms of service. Keep the discussion to being as productive and as lightning as only the internet knows how to do. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's competitors. Arguing in favor of socialism is Richard D. Wolff, a professor of economics who's previously taught at Yale and is also the host of Economic Update as well as Democracy at Work. He's authored several books on both Marxism and socialism, as well as a recent one covering the COVID epidemic called The Sickness is the System. Arguing in favor of capitalism is Stephen Bunnell II, known under the pseudonym Destiny. He began as a professional StarCraft 2 player and went on to revolutionize politics on the Twitch streaming platform. He's gone on to debate many of the largest public figures on both the right and the left corners of the political spectrum. Recently, he's become involved in campaigning for local politicians, and while his detractors on both sides have labeled him either a communist or a fascist, he prefers the moniker as the omni-liberal. Both contestants prefer he/him pronouns. Thank you so much for joining us. Without further ado, since he is arguing for a change to the current paradigm, we will begin with you, Professor Richard Wolff.
Okay, in the 3 minutes I have, I cannot speak as fast as you just did, so I won't even try. I'll try to make a couple of basic points. Every economic system in the history of the world displays the following pattern. It is born, it evolves over time, and then it dies and passes away, giving way to another one. And part of that process has always been the conviction of the people in each economic system that sooner or later they can, they should, and they will do better, overcome some of the problems and difficulties they're facing, and organize a system that better meets human needs. The process is sometimes relatively smooth, other times it's rocky. That varies with the conditions and particularly with the level of resistance from those who don't want to see the system change and shift. Capitalism, in my judgment, has been born, most would agree, has evolved over the last 3 centuries or so, and is now at that last stage. The only question now is exactly how and when the passing occurs. Likewise, in my judgment, the yearning for something better has built up in capitalism to a pretty intense level now. Whether you look at the debts of students, whether you look at the mind-bending inequality that this system generates over and over again, unless and until it is revolted against by masses of people who do something about the inequality, only to discover that as long as capitalism remains, the tendency to inequality resumes. I think people are also tired of the instability. Every 4 to 7 years, capitalism crashes. We've had 3 in this new century in its 20 years. Yep, right on schedule, every 4 to 7 years. Millions lose their jobs, businesses go belly up, cities and towns can't get the revenue they need to provide the services we depend on. One sign of the exhaustion of this system, a level of money creation, a level of debt creation we have never seen. Government debt, corporate debt, personal debt. The system is exhausted, and the entire private enterprise system is now on 24/7 government life support. I think it's over. I think that's difficult for us all to live through. And we better learn some lessons from the British Empire, from which they have been tumbling for a century. We could and should do better on the downswing than the British have been able to. And the more we talk about it and discuss it and explore it, the better our chances to make another progressive transition to a better system that we all need and will benefit from.
Okay, Destiny?
Oof, are you keeping us on a timer?
I am.
All right. As of March 2021, Americans rank the economy, job markets, the handling of the coronavirus, and leadership in Washington as the four most important challenges facing our country. Socialist policies would not alleviate any of these concerns. Countries have tried the socialist experiment. Time and time again, this has failed. Doctors in Cuba moonlight as taxi drivers. Countries with socialized healthcare haven't fared much better than the U.S. in their handling of the coronavirus. And any socialist regime will necessarily involve the bureaucracy of Washington even more heavily in our economy. Any country that has attempted to realize a fully socialist economy has either failed completely, such as in the case of the USSR, destroyed large swaths of their economy, such as in Venezuela, or been forced to embrace more neoliberal economic policies to realize true growth in their economy, such as in China or Vietnam. Liberal market policies work better in both theory and practice when it comes to efficiently allocating resources to maximizing the economic productivity of any country, and we've seen this play out time and time again across a wide variety of markets and countries throughout history across the globe. Oftentimes, people like Richard Wolff will bring up the boom-bust cycle as though it's an inherent flaw of capitalism, but I believe I speak for most when I say that a boom-bust cycle is preferable to just going bust, as so many socialist countries have. It's also important for us to realize that no economic organization is in and of itself inherently moral or immoral, but rather we ought to view them as tools to effect some greater output for our country that we can later utilize and distribute in the most fair manner with government policy to most of our citizens as we see fit, creating a bigger pie, so to speak, from which all of us can eat. Morality and justice should exist in the realm of government policy. We cannot allow it to blind us to the economic realities surrounding us. No matter how much we wish a wild lion not to eat us, our desire alone will never satiate its appetite. While socialism may sound good in theory, the destruction it would wrought on the wealth of our country and the oppressive restrictions it would place on our businesses would not help the vast majority of Americans. It would be foolish to enforce protectionist or socialist policies on our economy while major developing economies, such as India and China, are moving in the exact opposite direction, having realized time and time again the failures in socialist planning. Socialism implies two major things: a change in both the means and mode of production. The means of production change in such a way to completely disallow private investment or ownership, and a change in the mode of production such that we no longer produce goods and services for a profit. Instead, businesses are only started with the approval of some governmental body, some kind of central planning, with the equal decision-making and management of every worker, and the goods and services produced in any society are what some government body dictates, irrespective of market forces or the wants and desires of the citizens. It's likely in the course of this debate that my opponent will suggest we take after Nordic or Western European countries, citing that things like socialized healthcare or subsidized education are powerful programs that address many of the underserved needs of Americans today. While this is true, I would like to remind everyone that we've spent the last decade reminding conservatives that the government simply providing welfare has absolutely nothing to do with socialism. My opponent believes that strong social safety nets and welfare programs are important parts of the government. Most liberals would welcome him with open arms, me included. Consequently, there are 5 major hurdles that no socialist I have ever spoken to has adequately addressed, and they are as follows. Number 1, what level of violence is acceptable for you to reach our socialist state? Number 2, how do we decide which businesses are allowed to exist in a socialist society without allowing private capital investment? 3, is any form of investment whatsoever allowed in a socialist society for an expansion of business? 4, how are labor markets determined in a socialist society? And 5, how do we calculate which goods and services a nation needs if we do away with the commodity form? Those are my 5.
Cool. All right. So we're going to do the open format now for the next hour. I don't think I'm going to need to moderate too much. As long as both of you just say something and allow the other person to speak and don't talk over each other, it should be fine. So I guess begin now.
Where do you want to start?
Well, can I respond to what was said?
Yeah, whatever you want to do, yeah.
Okay. I find this a laughable caricature of anything I've ever written or anything that I understand is part of this conversation. And I don't appreciate being told what I think or what I say or what I mean or what I intend. I can speak for myself, and that would just be fine if we could allow each other to do that. Number 1. Number 2, I have no idea what this silly remark that I hear so often is, that no socialist society has succeeded at anything. I have no idea what you're talking about. Let me give you an example. One of the most important metrics used in the economics profession around the world to assess the quote-unquote success of an economic system is the rate of economic growth. You measure GDP and you look at how it grows over time. And then you compare one country to another to assess their relative success, not as societies, because that's a vague generality, but at this particular metric, which we use in economics to measure economic growth over time. It's not the only metric, but it's a widely used one. So I'm now going to use it. In the 20th century, The fastest growing metric, the fastest growing GDP in any country measured was the Soviet Union. And in the 21st century we're living in, the fastest growing GDP in the world has been the People's Republic of China. This is not an endorsement of one or another economic system. It's a statement of fact verified by any reliable source of information. The UN, the projects in the University of California, Berkeley, and others who keep track of this. So this has to be understood because in much of the world, economic growth is a shared objective and goal that these two societies have excelled at achieving, number one. Number two, when it comes to socialism, it would be useful if we all understood what the word means rather than playing around with caricatures. For example, the notion that socialism is all about what the government does has been contested throughout the history of socialism. And that idea is less dominant within the socialist tradition now than it ever was over the last 150 years. For example, today, one of the most important issues for socialists has to do not with government regulation, not with government owning and operating businesses, not with these bugaboos of bureaucracy and all the rest of it, but has to do with an objective of transforming the organization of production in a factory, in an office, in a store, not to have a small group of people, the owner, the board of directors, the tiny little minority at the top that is a dictatorial power inside an enterprise, making all the key decisions that the employees have to live with, even though the minority making those decisions is not accountable to those employees. That's a socialism of transformation at the micro level about which very little could have been discerned in the comments preceding these. If we're going to talk about socialism, then we have to talk about what it means to the people pushing for it and urging it. And those people have learned from the 20th and 21st century, just like those who pushed for capitalism 3 centuries ago learned from their early experiments how to refine, how to adjust, and how to change. To pretend that that didn't happen, to trade in old and shrinking conceptions of socialism may be good debating ploy, but it doesn't advance our understanding of anything.
Okay, if you want, it'd be easier to have more of a back and forth rather than the super long monologues each, so we can respond to each other more, if you're okay with that. Just for a couple of things that you said, so I'm trying not to miss...
I just talk slower than you.
Oh yeah, no, it's fine, it's fine. My understanding is that in the 20th century, there was a faster growing economy than the USSR, and it was Japan. Japan still exists today, and the USSR does not. I understand that the USSR did show a huge amount of growth, but I think it's odd to use that as an example when socialists often point to the evils of imperialism, and when you point out the fact that everybody was heavily industrializing around that time as well. I don't think it's fair to say that the USSR simply grew on the merits of socialism when there were so many other things happening at the time, and when it was outgrown by another economy that was...
But those are the facts. I mean, you can play whatever games you want. The fact of the matter is that the Soviet Union's performance in the 20th century completely outshines that of Japan. There's no comparison. In 1917, when the Soviet Union begins, it is the poorest country in Europe by far. It then goes through 70 years of a lost World War I, of a civil war, of an agricultural collectivization, and of World War II, which did more damage in Russia than in any other country. Notwithstanding that it was the poorest country at the beginning of this horrific story, it ends up in 1965 being the #1 competitor of the United States for global hegemony. That's only because of its #1 status in economic growth that it achieved the overcoming of all those horrific losses. I'm not arguing in favor of this or that about the Soviet Union, but the fact of its achievement is a staggering reality that you can dance around from here to tomorrow, but it doesn't go away because it's inconvenient to confront it. And the same thing is true now. If you read Pearl Buck's novels about China before the revolution, you will hear about a society whose depth of poverty literally blows your mind. And here they are about to surpass the United States before the end of this decade. And that was accomplished by a communist revolution and a government that has been run by a communist party to this day. And yeah, for sure, they cleverly opened their society up to capitalists to come and join them. But to imagine that the achievement of the Chinese economy is purely due to the private capitalists rather than to the state economy, that's making believe, because you need to have an argument that puts the success at the credit of one or the other. The infrastructure, the training of the mass of people, everything that happened in China is as much a product of the planning and policies of the communist government than of any other factor. And that has to be recognized as well. And none of this is an endorsement. That society has strengths and weaknesses. It has things we can criticize. But we can't make it up because it's inconvenient to face the successes they've had and continue to have.
Okay, so I'm not saying that the USSR did not grow a lot. Obviously, the USSR grew massively. Your claim is not that the USSR grew. That's not what we're arguing about. It's whether or not the USSR grew at the rate that it did due to socialism. A country that was heavily involved in multiple famines, a country that heavily went from little industrialization to a lot of industrialization, and a country that engaged in a lot of imperialistic practices is a country that grew massively in the 20th century. To say that all of their growth, or even the majority of their growth, was due to the organization of their economy and not due to factors that were independent of that organization, to say otherwise that they wouldn't have grown, maybe at an even faster rate, had they been a capitalist economy, there would have to be some evidence provided for that. And I don't believe that that's ever been adequately demonstrated. On the contrary, I believe some people have argued that Russia could have potentially grown, the USSR could have potentially grown even faster had it abandoned some of its more outdated forms of trying to manage their economy. When we bring up China, China has grown a lot under certain socialist policies for sure. But when we look at China, especially in the 80s and 90s, China began opening itself up to massive growth when it comes to foreign investment. China is the #2 country in the world that allows for foreign direct investment. And the coalescing of all of China's state-owned, the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, into a select few industries, and then the massive opening of foreign investment into that country to give other people more control over privately owned businesses has been what has caused the massive explosion that we've seen of China in terms of pulling people out of global poverty, as you mentioned in the video that you did for the Gravel Institute. You attribute that to socialist policies, but the thing that really pulled China into the 21st century in terms of economic success was the opening itself up to foreign direct investment, was the opening itself up to other economies being able to interact with them more, which are all neoliberal trade policies. These aren't people-owned businesses. These aren't businesses that are ran by the workers. These are, I mean, if anything, China is a government that runs the business itself. It's a state capitalist economy more so than any type of socialist or communist economy. To say that a single party regime is having the workers themselves making decisions over how any individual business is running, I don't think is fair to say. I guess one of the, and then real quick, just finishing.
Your understanding of China. Your understanding of China, though, is really badly flawed.
Can I finish this last part? The thing that confuses me the most, and the thing that frustrates me the most, I guess, when I have discussions with socialists, is socialism feels like this very amorphous, ever-transforming idea of what it actually is, such that I don't even know why we use the word anymore. So I'm very glad that you've acknowledged that Marx, through his labor theory value analysis, was absolutely flawed and was an absolute failure. I'm glad that you've acknowledged that the way of analyzing. I have not
acknowledged you're making this stuff up. I've never acknowledged anything of the word. Okay, well, I don't even know where you get this.
Well, earlier you just said that we shouldn't hold ourselves captive to the thinking of thinkers in the 19th century in terms of what socialism is. So I assume you've evolved.
No, I didn't do that at all. I told you that socialism has a variety of theories within it. It's a broad tradition. It had to be. In the 150 years since Marx wrote, his ideas have moved into every country on this earth at different levels of economic and cultural and political life. And of course, those different people all found something valuable, but they all made their own interpretations. This is a rich, diverse tradition. It's as if you're going to decide what it is I mean when I say these things. I never said that the Marxist theory isn't valuable, that the labor theory of value doesn't apply. If you read any of the books and articles I've pumped out in my life, you'd know that the exact opposite is the case.
Can you, when you say
something, wait a minute, I want to correct something about China because you keep repeating it.
Okay.
You know why private enterprise and private capital flows into China in the 80s and 90s? Because China had transformed itself from a place where nobody wanted to invest to a place like now where everybody does. Capitalist enterprises went there because they had a well-educated, disciplined labor force at very low wages, because they had built an extraordinary infrastructure, because you had a growing level of income for people to buy things. That's why General Motors produces and sells more cars in China than it does in the United States. The reason private capital went there was because they had, before the arrival, created the institutions. Every other part of the so-called third world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, who had received since the Second World War massive amounts of foreign aid, were desperately trying to do what the Chinese were doing, namely, develop their countries so that foreign private investment would come. China didn't get any foreign aid because they were communists and the United States didn't give them any. But they did a better job than all the countries who did get it in order to get to the point of economic development where it became interesting for capitalists in Japan and Europe to go there. You need to pretend, for reasons I do not understand, that all of the achievements I've just described didn't happen, that somehow they don't deserve the credit. Look, in the world of economics, maybe perhaps you're not familiar, we do exactly what you just said we oughtn't to do. We look at societies and say, they have a capitalist economic system. How did they do? And they have a socialist system with the different meanings of that term. And how did they do? And then we say they're different, and part, not all, part of the story is the different system. And if I say to you that the socialist tradition has multiple interpretations, let me assure you that the capitalist tradition does as well. The leaders of Saudi Arabia right now call themselves capitalists.
Can I ask you, when you say socialist, what do you mean when you say socialist then? I'm trying to understand what this means. Can you give me like a cohesive, coherent?
That's good. No, let me answer. There are a variety. I'll give you three basic strains right now. They don't exhaust it, but they enable us to have a conversation. One strain, you leave enterprises in the hands of private capitalists, but you recognize that that capitalist system is so flawed, for example, in terms of inequality, in terms of business cycle instability, that you give a role to the government of massive intervention, rules, regulations, laws. You know, let me give you some examples. In France, it's the law that once you begin working after graduating from high school or college, every employer has to give you 5 weeks of paid vacation from the beginning. Nothing like that exists in the United States. But this is a society that won that for its people, by the way, by socialists who did that, and put that on the books, as it is on most European countries. And socialists do that because they believe for them that socialism is when the government comes in and regulates. That's one kind. Here's a second kind. These second kind of socialists, they don't believe it works real well if you do that. It's not enough. So they want to take a different step. They want the government to come in and actually own and operate enterprises, not merely regulate them with rules and laws. Then there's a third kind, which I stressed a few moments ago, which is not about the government. Doesn't care all that much whether the government runs an enterprise or the private does. They can figure out whichever one works better. Let's be real practical. But for them, what socialism means is the transformation of the everyday life of working people. No longer do you go to work with other people telling you what to do, where to sit, what machine to use, what raw material to work on. And at the end of the day, you go home and you've got nothing more to say about what you poured your brains and muscles into. No, no, no. For these socialists, like me, the crucial thing is to reorganize the workplace, to bring real democracy, can you believe it, to the place where we work. In a country that claims to be democratic, we don't have democracy in the workplace. We have a tiny group of people telling the majority what to do, fully unaccountable to that majority. You know, if we really believed in democracy, this kind of socialism argues, we would recognize that that's where adults spend most of their adult life, at work. And if you really believe in democracy, it should have been installed in the workplace. But capitalism doesn't permit that. The folks at the top want to keep the power, to keep their inordinate wealth, even at the expense of no democracy and of a growth record inferior to what Russia did in the 20th century and what China is doing now. And that's an enormous price to pay.
Okay, so if you want to talk about the 2 and 3 definitions of socialism, that would be interesting to me, but I only heard 2 definitions of socialism here. Number 1 is just capitalism. I don't know when this redefining happened of taking capitalism plus government intervention and calling it. Wait, well, let me finish. Right? I don't know why this was the case that state intervention into private markets to have some form of regulation or some form of socialized healthcare or giving workers 5 weeks off became socialism. It is clearly not socialism. It's so not socialism that I think Marx himself even said that the state would be heavily required in maintaining capitalism, more so than I guess even Marx was able to foresee, because he predicted a revolution of the proletariat in his lifetime. The idea that the state intervening and providing some sort of social welfare or safety net is that's just strictly a capitalist system with some government intervention. If we want to talk about the concept of the government owning and operating enterprises, or number 3, the idea is that the workers themselves have some worker managed thing, I would be interested in discussing either of those 2 options, as I believe all 5 questions I laid out initially applied to them. But for number 1, I wholly reject that as a form of as a form of socialism. If you believe it is, I'd be curious if you can tell me what is the difference between the first thing you laid out and any capitalist that acknowledges that some level of government intervention is necessary in keeping the economy going.
I'd be glad to explain it to you. The history of socialism gets going in the middle of the 19th century. And at that time, socialists began to argue that capitalism was over, capitalism was done, and a better system was available and should be pursued. And they had a whole bunch of ideas about that. They were a relatively small group. If you know the history of Marx and Marxism, it begins relatively small. As the 19th century progresses, it gets larger and larger. And guess what happens when that movement gets larger? Debates begin to happen inside of it as to what in the world capitalism is and what in the world socialism is. And here we go. Some of the people decided that socialism as a radically alternative system wasn't in the cards. Could never happen in some views, could only happen in a distant future. Well, what then did socialists do in the meanwhile before a real change of system happened? Answer: advocate for the government to be taken over by universal suffrage. The mass of people would institute a socialism that was, if you like, a step in that direction. An early socialism, if you like. And by the way, there were big debates, pro and con, within the socialist movement about this. But they settled to understand, let's call it one kind of socialism. And that's what you have in Western Europe, in Scandinavia, to this day. Socialist parties advocate that, and the people in that society often vote those folks into power. I'll give you an example. The government in Portugal right now, a perfect example, European country. The government of Portugal is a coalition of 3 political parties. The largest is the Portuguese Socialist Party. The second one is the Portuguese Communist Party. And the third one is the Portuguese Green Party. They were elected as a coalition government in 2016. They were re-elected last year. Parenthetically, if your audience members don't know about this, that's because you live in a society that doesn't tell you about this, even though it's public knowledge to anyone interested in finding out. Those parties push a socialist agenda by which they mean government rules and regulations. You may not like to call it socialists, but the people involved, and millions of them around the world, do. The other kind of socialism broke away from this first kind in the aftermath of the Soviet Revolution. They were in favor of taking that extra step. Socialism for them meant that the government should take over and operate enterprises, at least the industrial ones, maybe later the agricultural ones. And to underscore their distinction from the other socialists who just wanted government rules, regulations, and controls, they gave themselves the name communist. And that's the only difference between them, and it has been that way for nearly a century now, since the Russian Revolution. And then there's this third one, which has to do with transforming the workplace. Those are all socialisms. They argue, they debate, they have a rich literature. We have lots of empirical examples of all three kinds in the world. And if people want to think about how they work and what kind of society they produce, there's loads of evidence there. We don't have to hypothesize or pretend or demonize either, because really it doesn't lend itself to that if you're serious.
Okay, first of all, just because a government calls itself socialist, I don't think that that's adequate to define said government as socialist. Do you agree with that?
Give another, fine, you can have another, that's what the debate is about. You make up your definition.
Hold on 1 second.
Well,
yeah, okay, so we have to give Destiny a chance to speak as well.
Yeah, wait, well, so my question would be like in terms of like...
have opportunities to give...
I guess like would you consider, like, for instance, like the Nazi Party, would you consider that a socialist party as they have socialism in the name? It doesn't seem like a good...
No. But
why not?
The minute you know anything about the Nazi Party, you'd understand that.
Would you say that is Portugal a socialist economy? Or do they have markets? Do they have private investment?
Markets have nothing to do with socialism.
Okay, can you tell me what is your definition of capitalism then? Because when I ask you what is socialism to you, I'm like, I understand that you can talk a lot and you can tell me what other people have considered socialism to be, but under your current definitions, for instance, the Democratic... No, you haven't given me your definition. You've told me what other thinkers and what other countries in the past... Your definition is not what Portugal does, or it's not what the Portuguese Socialist or Communist Party is. You're giving me what other people or other thinkers have thought what socialism is. Because under your current definition, number one, the Democratic Party in the United States would be considered a socialist party because they're in favor of heavy government intervention in terms of climate change or healthcare. And I don't know if you would agree. Would you agree that the Democratic Party in the United States of America is a socialist party, or if they rebranded themselves? Okay, so it's clear then that the naming mechanism alone isn't enough for you, because the Nazi Party obviously called themselves socialists. I don't think many people, me included, would consider themselves socialist. And it's obvious that there must be some outside definition that you are alluding to, that when you call something socialist. So I'm just trying to figure out what can you tell me, what is capitalism to you? What does it mean when an economy or a society is a capitalist economy? What does that mean to you?
Well, let me answer. I gave you three definitions of socialism. I told you they weren't the only three. This is a debate that's been going on inside socialism, and it's perfectly reasonable for me to give you those three. It might be nice for you if there was one you could cling to, but that's not the way it is. The tradition is too big, too broad, too global for there to be one definition, as there is in most interesting things in the world, and certainly in many large organizations and large traditions. I did give you my own. My own is focused on the transformation of the workplace. It's more interested in the micro transformation than in the macro ones, and particularly skeptical about the power of the government as having had some bad consequences. I want to learn from these early efforts to build socialism so that the future revolts against capitalism will have a better outcome than the ones that we've already had.
What is capitalism?
Let me finish. They achieved many things we want to hold on to, and they made some mistakes we want to avoid. And that's exactly what it means to learn from the past. Now let me address the question of capitalism. Here's what capitalism is not distinguished by, and therefore is not useful as a definition: markets. Slavery has markets. It's a different economic system. Feudalism had markets for much of its history. That's not a definition of capitalism that's unique. Capitalism doesn't uniquely have markets. That's silly. Free or controlled markets, which is all we've ever had in the world, the controlled kind, are as old as Plato and Aristotle, who argued over markets. By the way, both of them opposed markets and thought they were socially destructive institutions, just for as a footnote you might be interested in. But capitalism is unique in one way. It's not a system that's unique in its markets. It's not a system that's unique in its quote-unquote free enterprises. Those are as old as Methuselah. But here is what's unique. Earlier systems, for example, slavery, organized the production of goods and services around a dichotomy, a slave and a master. The master owned all the equipment, all the means of production, and including the worker himself and herself. He owned them. And that was a very unusual way of organizing things, but it existed for a long time. Did it have markets? Often. Did it sometimes exist without markets? You bet. Then there's feudalism, radically different. No master, no slave. Nobody's anybody else's property. But you know how that works? You have a small group of lords at the top and a mass of serfs at the bottom. And the way the system works is that the serfs swear loyalty to the lord, and the lord in return to the serf. And the whole thing is sanctified in Europe by the Catholic Church.
Okay,
let me finish. Then comes capitalism. It's not a master and a slave. It's not a lord and a serf. It's a completely different arrangement. It's a contract. It's an employer and an employee. They don't swear anything to one another, and neither owns the other one. But they enter into a contract in which the employer says, I'm going to give you a wage at the end of the week. You're going to give me your brains and muscles for these hours of these days, and that's a deal we're going to make, and that's how we organize production. That's the distinction of capitalism.
No,
that's
it's
what
not.
I mean by capitalism.
You haven't given me a definition of capitalism at all. You've told me a bunch of things that capitalism isn't, and then you've given me a bunch of random collected facts of history, but none of these things
Not at all.
are... Wait, hold on. Absolutely.
I didn't do that.
For instance, when you talk about how markets aren't unique to capitalism, that's great. Worker management isn't unique to socialism. Worker management can exist under a capitalist system right now.
But
I know that you like to talk about Mondragon a lot. Mondragon... Hold on.
Let Destiny finish. Let Destiny finish. We're going to go one at a time here, okay? So let Destiny finish it and we'll continue.
When we talk about worker-managed firms or worker-managed co-ops, these things exist under capitalism. What are you saying then? Can I hold on real quick? I'm sorry. Can I get an explicit answer that is answered within the last 50 years without going back into feudalism or what the Pope said or the schism of the Catholic Church? I want to know very concretely, without moralizing or loading anything, or without talking about something that happened in 1850. What is capitalism to you? Can you just tell me or explain what capitalism is? Because it sounds like go ahead.
Any definition of anything is a process of separating it from that which it is not. That's all any definition ever was.
But we don't typically give definitions by naming every single thing that something's not.
Okay, let him answer. Let him answer this.
Dog is you differentiate it from a cat. Otherwise, there's no way to do it.
That's
to
not even
differentiate
true.
And to give a definition of capitalism, you have to distinguish it from that which it is not. Those other systems didn't use an employer-employee relationship. That is the core distinguishing quality of capitalism. Slavery doesn't have that. Feudalism doesn't have that. And I never used the phrase worker management. Managers are not what we're talking about. Owning and operating. If you want to use a word, it's workers as their own boss, workers as their own board of directors. If you like, you can use the colloquialism in the United States that has existed throughout our history. A worker co-op, a cooperative, one worker, one vote, all decisions, majority vote. That doesn't exist in capitalism. That exists in a different relationship among the people at the workplace. Not slavery, not feudalism, and not employer-employee, because those are different people. in each of those systems. Worker co-op, that's no longer the case. That's why it's a radically different socialist system, unlike any of the others.
How can you say that that's unlike any of the others when co-ops can exist today under capitalist economies?
Slavery can exist and did.
You're not answering my question. I don't want you to give the negative of everything I'm saying. You're saying today that this is a unique thing that exists.
There's never been a problem in any society of which we have historical record for different class structures, different systems to coexist. You're asking me a question as if it were, is this possible? It's never been anything other than the norm.
But you're telling me that in your society, or I could be wrong, you can correct me, but it sounds like in your society, you would exclusively like firms to be in the hands of workers, which would necessarily preclude.
Not at all. I've never written that. I've never said it. You're just attributing things to me.
Okay. I'm sorry. I'm trying very hard to understand what you're saying, but the problem is your answers are very long-winded. You're not really answering my question. So, am I to understand then that you are in favor of a society where workers have the option to vote on and have control over the workplace, but there's also room for private investment and the government intervenes in things like healthcare or education? Is this like the type of society you're aiming for?
My guess would be that the transition from capitalism to what I'm talking about would have long periods of time, typically, where these different class structures, these different systems coexist with one another.
Okay, that's what we have today.
No, you don't have it in anything like the way I want it.
Well, how do you want it? What's different from your vision than what we have today?
Well, what we have today is predominantly capitalist with smatterings of the other. I'm interested in having predominantly socialist with smatterings of the other.
And
that's the difference.
And without disallowing private investment or disallowing individual owners, how do you get there?
Private investment is a completely different matter. You can have private investment and worker co-ops.
How?
It exists. What's the problem?
Why would I ever invest in a company without gaining some amount of equity in the company? They have no obligation to return to me any profit. I would never invest in a co-op.
Why would you invest in you invest in businesses in the United States?
Correct, because businesses.
Let me finish. Hoping, for example, for something called a capital gain.
Mm-hmm.
You hope that if you buy the shares and if the company does real well, you will be able to sell the shares at some future point to another investor at a higher price.
Correct.
If that company's growth is the product of its worker co-op organization, you're perfectly happy if you can make an investment that grows over time.
But in your world, those shares don't exist.
Give you an example. First of all, there exist where these kinds of enterprises exist in the world. So this is not a hypothetical.
Then they're not worker co-ops by definition.
Sure they are.
A worker okay, tell me, my definition might be incorrect, so you can correct me. My understanding is that what makes something a worker co-op or what makes something employee-owned is that the means of production or whatever firm you operate at is wholly owned and operated by the workers, meaning that when profits are generated by that company, they're returned to the workers, and when decisions are made about that company, those decisions are made by the workers. If that is the definition that we're going by, there is no room for private investment there.
Right, but that's the wrong definition and not the one that operates in the world.
Give me your definition.
The definition of a worker co-op is that the workers make the key decisions. They are their own board of directors. They may make the decision democratically to raise capital for their business by selling shares. Of course they could do that. Those shares would not allow the people who own them to do the steps that they can in capitalism. They would not, for example, be able to dictate who's the board of directors because the workers themselves are their own board of directors. But there's no problem with private investment. There never was.
And my question is why? No, I don't need an example. No example. We have this definition. Okay, I just want to hone in on this definition. Okay, my question is why would any individual ever invest in a company that doesn't have a fiduciary responsibility to their investors? So, for instance, in your world, if I were to buy 20% of a co-op, their workers tomorrow could say, you know what? We're all bored. We don't want to do this anymore. We're going to move on. We're shutting the business down. And now I've just completely lost out on my investment because they have no responsibility to me because I have non-controlling shares. If the only shares you're selling are non-controlling, why would any private investment ever come in knowing that that co-op never has an obligation to make a profit or return a dividend to the investors?
There's many companies listed on the stock exchange right now that pay no dividends to their investors here in the United States. It's a normal part of our
No, absolutely not. They might not pay
What are you talking about?
I'm talking about Capital Markets 101. They might not pay a dividend, but
then you're badly misinformed.
I'm not bad. I promise you, the foundation of the stock market in the United States is a returning of capital to the people that are the ones doing the investment in companies. Now, it might be the case, as you correctly point out. Absolutely. It might be the case.
Really?
Yeah, really.
You're unaware.
Most
of the most dynamic companies in this country are selling stock to people to whom they have no responsibility, legal or otherwise, to give them a dividend ever.
Okay, Professor, do you believe that a dividend is the only way that you can return capital to shareholders?
That's not the point.
That absolutely is the point.
You made the point. What is the company responsible for? The company's responsible to run the company. They are not responsible to give money back, whether it's dividend, return of capital, or any other way, to the people who give them the money to buy shares. The people who give them the money are gambling. They hope that they can sell the shares for more, and they will sell the shares to anybody who can buy them. The company's not responsible to buy those shares. The company's not responsible for what price they can get. If they lose their shirt, tough luck. It's not an obligation or a responsible. That's the way the law of this country works for the stock market. And there's no problem in a worker co-op saying to investors, we're going to grow better than what you can get from a capitalist enterprise. So buying a share of our stock will give you a better shot to sell it at a higher price later. And I can give you examples.
Wait, I don't want examples. No. We don't need examples because
I'm going to give you an example of a company that did that, just so you can see why an investor would do it. I mean, you can make the theater of your hand on your
I'm not
face.
making the problem is you said something that's just so on its face absurdly incorrect about the characterization of U.S. capital markets. Do you not agree that there exists a legally binding, the SEC literally regulates fiduciary responsibilities to investors? I don't like this trick you've pulled by making it sound like, let me finish, please, let me finish. Let me finish. You've made it sound as though I believe the only way to return capital to shareholders is through dividends. That's absolutely not the case. That's one reading of it. You can return it via stock buybacks. You can return it via increase in growth of a company.
You're not obligated to do any of that.
You have a fiduciary responsibility to your shareholders. Of course you do.
If you take my advice, I teach these courses. If you read what fiduciary responsibility means, it's an abstract generalization. It can be easily demonstrated in thousands of legal cases that there is no obligation of any material sort that they return money to the people who invest in them. It is perfectly okay to run your business as you think it should best be done, short of committing fraud or illegal activity, and that would apply in any system. The investor is taking a chance, buying your shares in the hopes of selling them at a higher price. It happens all the time, and it would be perfectly consistent with workers who run their own enterprises and are their own board of directors. That's not a problem. Never was. There's nothing inconsistent with private investment on the one hand and worker co-ops on the other. Now, if you have a worker co-op system, they might decide, because we have democracy now, that they don't want that they would like to be the owners as well as the board of directors of their own enterprise. That's possible. That would be one of the variations of worker co-op economic systems, just like we have variations of capitalist systems.
Can I ask you, in a private business in the United States, if I invest my money in a business, a publicly traded business, if they were to cash out all of that money, just close the business down and run, you're telling me that in the United States that company wouldn't be held liable for scamming its investors?
Absolutely. If that company had a good lawyer and showed that they made an honest effort to have a business and then it didn't work out and they closed it down, the investor would have absolutely no standing.
Exactly. You're right. But you used a word there, an honest effort, and it's doing all the heavy lifting in that statement. Of course, you absolutely must show a court that you are making a good, this is part of your fiduciary responsibility. You are making a good faith effort to return money.
That's what the worker co-ops could easily do. We're making a good faith, honest effort to make a business. And that business requires us to do X, Y, and Z. And the private investor got nothing to do. That happens every day.
That's not what a worker co-op's maximizing for, though. A worker co-op, if by your definition, which is a democratically voted organization, is going to be trying to take into account what their members are voting for. They might not vote in the best interest of a shareholder. They might vote to do something completely different with the company.
That would be understood by the shareholder.
But that's my entire point.
Only the most naive shareholder in the United States believes that the company's decisions are intended to do the best for the shareholder. I can show you 50,000 legal cases in which that's not the case, and which it is contested in the courts, and you could have that in a worker.
That's great, and I can show you the Dow Jones, the Nasdaq, and the S&P 500. We could go to the UK and look at the FTSE 250, the FTSE 1, and I can show you histories of markets where companies do reliably over long periods of time return profits, whether in the form of dividends or the increase in your share price, to people that invest in those companies. I'm sure you can show me a lot of things that happen that are bad in capital markets where companies scam people, much as I can show you bad things that happen like famines under the USSR. But pointing out to a few bad actors does not clear up the problem of the fact that investing in a co-op where the workers have no obligation to return anything to an investor.
We're not talking about bad actors. You're inventing these things. We were talking about private investment and worker co-ops. You had made a statement that these somehow couldn't coexist. I'm explaining to you that there's not the slightest problem. You want to change the topic, that's very nice, but that's what the topic was. We weren't comparing goods and bad stories. We were explaining how and why private investment is not an either or in relationship to worker co-ops. One of the fastest growing industries in Spain is something called the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation. It's a family of worker co-ops.
They're not even worker managed, though. I don't know. This isn't even a good.
It is the seventh largest corporation in Spain.
It's a federation of corporations.
Excuse me?
It's a federation of corporations, and it's not even worker managed. That's just worker owned, and they have all the same exploitative problems. They go to South America for labor. They rely on contract labor. Chomsky has criticized the Mondragon thing for existing in a capitalist framework forever. And even if this was your go-to killer example, the Mondragon Federation of Co-ops exists under a capitalist framework.
Could I finish, or do you need to tell me about the Mondragon Corporation?
I didn't mean to interrupt your lecture. I'm sorry. Continue.
Sure you did. Come on. Who you think you're kidding? The Mondragon Corporation has many parts. The biggest single part of it are a collection of worker co-ops. If this were the United States, we'd call it a holding company, which is a collection of subsidiaries that do a variety of things. It's very common in the United States, and it's very common in the world of worker co-ops to do that as well. The different divisions help each other. The co-ops support one another. That's how the Mondragon Corporation went from 6 people in 1956 to over 100,000 now. Most of the people in the Mondragon Corporation function within their members, about 200 companies, each of which has workers, one person, one vote, making democratic decisions. This company has been extraordinarily successful. It has outcompeted its capitalist competitors. That's how it became so large. That's how it becomes so successful as it has been. It has rules. It maximizes, because you raised that before, a variety of objectives. It is not focused exclusively on profits. The notion that profit is the bottom line is the very convenient economic nonsense, because profits go into the hands of the capitalists at the top. And of course, they want the company to maximize profits because that's what they get. They don't maximize wages because that's what they don't get. Other people get that. If the other people ran the business, its objectives would not just be profit, but the well-being of those workers, the community's well-being, a whole lot of other objectives to maximize. And you'd have to choose among them. You wouldn't have the essential profit maximizing, which we teach in economics, without explaining to our students that by maximizing profit, the whole company's life is devoted to maximizing the return of a very small number of people within it. Okay? This is what is changed in a worker co-op. That's why it's so different from capitalism. Its decisions, investment, growth, distribution of income, all the big decisions would be made with a different set of objectives, because a different set of people with different interests are making those decisions. For a society like ours that blabbers on about democracy, you'd think this was the most attractive possible way to proceed because it democratizes the economy by democratizing the enterprises at the core of that economy. Instead, we live in a society which pretends that you can have political democracy, even though in economics you have an autocracy, a tiny aristocracy running each enterprise, doing what it wants, maximizing the part of the output it gets, namely the profit. And therefore, we get surprised that our political democracy doesn't work real well. Hello, that's because it's trying to sit on top of an economic system that is the opposite of democratic. The proposal of socialists is a proposal to extend democracy from the political realm to the economic realm. Why that is frightening to people who otherwise say they favor democracy, I find amazing.
I find it equally amazing that throughout this entire monologue, all you're advocating for are liberal markets with a little bit more government intervention. If you want to talk about Mondragon, absolutely. If you want to talk about Mondragon, we can talk about Mondragon until we're both blue in the face. One, it's not worker managed, okay? It is just worker owned. A lot of the management that comes within a lot of the Mondragon Federation come from other workers, but they do not vote on all of their policies or productions. That is absolutely not true. Number two, Mondragon does run itself for profit. That's why if you only change the means of production and not the mode of production, you are still producing commodities for a profit. Now, it happens in this case that the profit is going to the workers, but it still absolutely runs for a profit. That's why socialists point to it and say, look at how successful it is. Part of the reason why it's successful is the amazing revenues and profits that it returns to its workers that are generated. And then number three, Mondragon, in order to continue growing, one of the problems that Mondragon has started to face recently, and it's one of the reasons why it's criticized by people like Chomsky, is because it's had to continue to acquire more and more workers that do not get controlling shares, that don't have the ability to vote on what's going on. Mondragon also trades across markets, including going to places like South America and trading with exploited workers. So I don't think that Mondragon exists under a capitalist mode of economics. Like, Mondragon exists and interacts with other people within a capitalist economy, which I think is good. If Mondragon works and succeeds, that's awesome. I think it's cool. I like to see alternative types of businesses succeed. But I don't understand how you can talk about the successes of Mondragon and then say that, like, well, this is an example of the failures of capitalism when Mondragon exists and thrives right now under a capitalist framework, interacting with so many other capitalist sections of the economy and so many other capitalist countries in the world. My problem is that by moving more towards what you want, you would use government policy to necessarily disallow the types of private ownership or private investment that have been so important with other types of inventions or creations around the world. You can keep saying that I'm making stuff up, but at the end of the day, the problem that we're having.
Let me explain.
The problem we're having is the definition of socialism, and I notice that this is it seems to be a key problem with people that call themselves socialists, is your definition of socialism is so amorphous and morphing at any particular point in time. I still don't really have...
Well, you seem to be having trouble with it, but that doesn't make it amorphous.
It absolutely is amorphous. Even your definition of capitalism is absolutely amorphous, where I hear ruling...
Well, you're just not familiar with it.
I'm absolutely familiar with it. I absolutely am able to. If you would like to ask me for my definitions of many of these things, I would be glad to explain it. And you can tell me, you can correct me, Professor, if you think I'm incorrect in my understanding of things. But I believe that when I ask you to tell me, like, what is capitalism, what is socialism, and it feels like I'm listening to Trebek, read off the board in Jeopardy, I feel like that's damaging to the position that you're trying to explain more so than me asking the question.
Yeah, well, let me correct you about Mondragon, which is, by the way, how it's pronounced. Mondragon has multiple parts. Some of the parts are the adjustments it's made to living in a capitalist world. That's absolutely correct. That would have to be any worker co-op that forms now or has in...
Wait, Lance, can you hear me? Losing the connection. Richard,
and industries that grew up in feudalism.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. Do you mind repeating that last line? You just cut out there for 1 second.
Mm-hmm. Right. Any worker co-op that forms now has to exist within a framework of a society that's organized differently. That's exactly the way it was when capitalism emerged out of feudalism. The early capitalist enterprises, towns, villages, had to exist within a feudal framework. They had to come to terms with that. Some of them were able to do it. Others of them disappeared or were overthrown by feudalism until they got big enough and strong enough and learned from the mistakes of early experiments in capitalism how to set up a system that would be what it now is, the global system. I expect the socialists to kind of replicate that experience. Russia was an experiment. China's a better one. Cuba, Vietnam, and so on. They make efforts. They're learning what you do, what you don't do, what you replicate, what you avoid, and they will get eventually to the scale and sense of how to do it on a more global scale. That's how feudalism happened. That's how slavery happened. That's how capitalism happened. And it's reasonable to expect that's how socialism will happen. There is no simple definition of socialism that would be, to use your words, correct. No agency gives you out a license. This is correct. That one isn't. A tradition as lively, as global as socialism is always going to have different interpretations, different definitions that argue with one another. That's healthy, that's normal, there's nothing fuzzy or amorphous about it. The idea that you can have one definition is an authoritative and authoritarian notion that there isn't debate and contestation when there always is. My job was to give you three of the major definitions of socialism that contest in the world today, that are widely accepted. By everybody? Of course not. But those are the ones that are around, and it's reasonable to talk about the tradition in that way. Mondragon is, let me finish. Mondragon is an experiment, a very successful one. You can, if you like, attribute everything to capitalism that happens that's good, and attribute everything bad that happens to the absence of capitalism.
I'm not doing that. I've never done that.
Interesting. And that's really not very interesting, and I'm not going to get into that. I will tell you that there are some remarkable things that Mondragon has done. Along the way, the majority of its workers voted the following rule. The best paid person in Mondragon cannot get more than 8 to 9 times what the least best paid person is.
That's this was an true. Attempt
to... I've been there. Okay. I've watched it.
It's just not true. So you're telling me that of all the employees in Mondragon, the highest paid employee...
That was a decision made by a large number of the worker co-ops that make that kind of decision.
So you're telling me that the highest paid employee in Mondragon, it has a ratio of what they're...
Let me finish. In many of the component co-ops...
Okay, that's correct.
Company. It's a holding company of many, many co-ops. In many, many of those co-ops, I can't speak for everyone, this was a common rule.
Sure.
I went and spoke with them. I interrogated them about it. And that's what I discovered. They passed a rule after much debate that a maximum difference of 8 to 1. You know that corporate CEOs in this country get roughly, on average, 300 times what the lowest paid worker or even the average worker in their employee class
What is the ratio of the... What is the ratio?
Let me finish. They were able to do something about inequality. Wow, here they are, successful and growing. They're the 7th biggest corporation. They're the envy of most other corporations in Europe who cannot show such a history. But they were concerned not just to maximize profit, but to do something like limit the inequality that otherwise is so corrosive to societies like ours. And they were able to do that. That's an interesting quality. Thomas Piketty released a book in 2014 in which he demonstrates in 600 pages that every single capitalism we have a record of has built into it a tendency to ever greater inequality that is only periodically interrupted by revolts from below, like what we had in the 1930s in this country, which never are durable, because once the revolt passes, the tendency of capitalism to inequality grows. That has always been an inspiration to socialists to advocate for a system that might have within it a built-in mechanism to at least reduce the inequality that haunts capitalism. And the reality is that Mondragon, and not only that, have demonstrated that there is a quality of worker co-ops that does and effectively a good job of addressing the inequality that otherwise haunts capitalism. And that would be an interesting way to understand why socialists would be drawn. They are not worker managed. The way a corporation works is there are three layers roughly: the employees, who do most of the work; the managers, who supervise the employees; and then another group of people to whom we give the name directors, the board of directors. The shareholders elect the board of directors because they're the ones who receive legally the profits, and they decide what is to be produced, how it's to be produced, what technology to use, where the production happens, and what is done with the profits. The managers don't do that. So to talk about
gentlemen, we're coming up to the hour now. We have had a disproportionate amount of talking time, I think, by you, Professor Wolff. Well, at the same time, Destiny, would you want to give a closing statement to this as we're coming up? I'll give you a couple minutes to respond. I
take issue. Sure, yeah. Man, there's so many things. I just think it's incredibly disingenuous to open with Mondragon has 80,000 employees and they voted to have an 8-to-1 pay between owners and their or not owners, the highest paid employee and the lowest paid employee. But that's not true. You corrected yourself after I corrected you, which I'm grateful for. It's within the co-ops, within that federation. I'm willing to bet that if I were to ask you, you probably couldn't tell me what the highest paid employee within the Mondragon Federation is. What is the ratio of their pay to the lowest paid employee of the Mondragon Federation? Because it has an incredible vertical structure in terms of how it interacts with itself. Now, I could just as easily construct you a world where the ratio of pay between the CEO of Amazon or Walmart is much smaller, where the ratio closes between their lowest paid employee. If I create a Walmart or Amazon holding company and I simply split off all the managerial people or some sectors of that company into their own individual companies and break it up like that, the way that Mondragon has. Not to say that Mondragon has failed. Not to say that they have totally different sectors. They have. I'm not making this stuff up. Everybody can go and look at how the company is structured. Everybody can go and look at the different types of things. They have grocery stores. They've got a financial sector.
All right. One at a time.
Yes, but they do not separate out their managers. They do not separate out one group of workers with high pay from others. That's a hustle. That would be a hustle.
I agree. It would be a hustle.
That about Mondragon is that's make believe.
Do you acknowledge that
your argument is so difficult that you have to make up the information to support it?
My argument is so concrete that I don't think I've had to bring up feudalism a single time to make any of my points or ask you any questions related to any of your points.
Make your analysis a little richer than it is.
Something I'm curious about. Why wouldn't you consider, just going by the incredibly generous definition you give me on point one of socialism, why wouldn't you consider the Democratic Party in the United States a socialist party? As a party that wants to see more stuff returned to Americans, wants to see people with a greater control of the workplace, had members that were pushing for 20% ownership in the share of companies, Bernie Sanders at AOC. Why wouldn't you consider the Democratic Party in the United States a socialist party?
Because it opposes almost everything you just mentioned. It has a small wing now that is in favor of it, who, by the way, call themselves socialists. But the establishment of the Democratic Party, its history over the last 100 years, since Franklin
Wait, that's
Roosevelt.
Not fair. Why would you talk about the history of it? That's not relevant.
Because history is always
it's
present
absolutely
with us.
not relevant. You said yourself that the history. No, you said yourself that the way that we look at socialism today is different than it was 100 years ago.
Joseph Biden is a product of that history, as he himself says. That party has been unable to make a government. They couldn't even preserve the level of government intervention that was achieved in the 1930s. The last 70 years have been a rollback of the New Deal, an undoing of it, and that was done as much by the Democratic Party as the Republicans. The Republicans pushed harder. The Democrats could not only not advance on what was achieved in the 1930s. They couldn't even preserve it. That's why we have an unemployment problem now and have had a terrible experience.
I think we have an unemployment. No, absolutely not. An unemployment problem.
Politician proposed a jobs program of the federal government the way it worked so well in the 1930s. You couldn't even have the courage to come up with what was already done. It's been a retreat. The Democratic Party has been a retreat from what it did before. All that AOC and Bernie are trying to do is to bring back the little bit of socialism that the last 75 years of the Democratic Party have been devoted to getting rid of. That's why they're so embarrassed, these political centrists, by the rise of the left. They thought it was over.
No, this is an unimaginable analysis of political parties today in the United States. I don't think the closed shop policies that Biden are advocating for represent some walk back in policies, or I don't think that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party push equally or even remotely similarly for the types of economies that they'd like to see today. Whether or not you have problems with how the Democratic Party functions, I don't know if your issues are with the Democratic Party or with the politicians that Americans elect. I know that it's a very popular pastime among lefties to demonize the Democratic Party for not being able to authoritarianly or totalitarianly rule the country, absent, the other half of Congress. It seems like a lot of people on the left don't seem to understand how our government functions. I don't know if that includes you or not. I think just
lucky,
given
we have folks like you that will help us.
I guess we'll see.
Yes.
All right.
The thing that I've learned the most today, I'm happy to see that the Democratic Party, under definition 1 of socialism, I guess, is considered at least somewhat of a socialist party of view, as they are believers of enterprise and private capitalists. And I guess,
I just spoke against that. How you got out of that?
You started to appeal. You started to appeal to things the Democratic Party has advocated for, or you appealed to a history 100 years back. Like, okay.
We've turned into a Fox News channel. Let's slow it down. We're gonna get right to the audience Q&A. Okay. All right. So we have hundreds and hundreds of questions. Unfortunately, we're not going to get to all of them. I'm going to try and time both of your responses to about 2 minutes. So I'll give you like a 10 to 15 second warning when you're coming up to that. So the first one is going to you, Destiny. What could convince you that your system or your defense of capitalism is wrong and that socialism is a better path forward?
I think seeing these things tried on a smaller level and then having more success on larger and progressively larger levels would be convincing. The thing that oftentimes troubles me when people advocate for different economic systems is, much like Wolff has done and says, maybe in the future he won't say he's done this, but the moralizing of like the relationship between an employee and employer, or the moralizing of different aspects of who owns the means of production or who works in the means of production. I'm not really interested in the relationship between a boss and a worker. What I'm more interested in are the material conditions of people at the end of the day. If different relationships are more beneficial to growing the economy rather than shrinking the economy but producing a quote-unquote better relationship, I'm more in favor of the former than the latter. I like capitalism because I think that having private enterprise adequately allocates capital into sectors of the economy that desperately need that capital allocated to it. I understand that Wolff is laughing because he's probably going to say something like, oh, well, what about healthcare and education? And I'm so glad that me and the rest of my liberal and even neoliberal friends agree that there are times when the government can step in and it can alleviate some of the problems that the free market doesn't address. For instance, capitalism doesn't solve well for things like healthcare or education, something that we desperately need to realize in the United States as we work to, I guess you could say, socialize those industries, which I'm so glad can happen in a capitalist framework.
All right. Professor Wolff, do you want to respond to any of that or just get a direct question? And if you are going to respond, I'm going to just keep the timing to the 2 minute window.
No, I think this is rehashing stuff we went over. So how about another question?
All right. So for Professor Wolff, were a state to become socialist, how would it thrive within a hostile capitalist world without resorting to the authoritarianism and imperialism of 20th century socialism?
I find this sort of remarkable, these kinds of questions. Imperialism. The imperialism that we study as people who are interested in this topic is a product of capitalism. The subordination of the third world, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, was a subordination organized and operated by capitalist institutions and capitalistically dominated societies. Imperialism, serious issue for sure, but it is a serious issue that is the product and the activity of capitalism. If you would like to talk about things the Soviet Union did and China has done in terms of their activities in and around other countries, and you want to apply the term imperialism, fine, you'd have to make some adjustments because the logic was different and the outcomes were different, and the scale of it was utterly different. We didn't have, the Soviets and the Chinese, at least not yet, have had not organized world wars to hold on and to expand their imperialist empires like World Wars I and II. So I find the whole question strange to put forward, especially without any explanation. And now to address briefly the question. What a state that became socialist would do depends on which of the three basic definitions I offered that state embraced. If it believed that socialism was what you have in Western Europe and Scandinavia, that's what it would do. It would have no problem. Excuse me?
Oh, we got 15 seconds left.
Okay. That's what it would do. If it followed the Soviet model, that's what it would do. And if it did the kind of thing that I'm advocating and the socialists like me do, then it would be devoted to changing the organization of enterprises by bringing democracy into enterprise inside capitalist enterprises.
Okay, to Destiny, do you think that Jeff Bezos works hundreds of thousands of times harder than his workers? Why should he be the richest person in the world?
You don't get compensated based on how hard you work. You get compensated based on the demand for your particular set of skills. There's probably less people that can work in the position that Bezos does than there are people that can work in any other more entry-level position at Amazon.
Wow.
Okay.
Wait, do you disagree with that? Do you think just as many people could handle being the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company as could handle being somebody that works in a grocery store or a fast food restaurant? Is there a simple yes or no to that, or am I about to get another lecture?
Well, you don't want an answer. You just want the answer you want. You don't want it in a form that I would prefer.
Can I get an answer that doesn't involve feudalism?
That's not cute. Is that what the point is here?
Okay.
Why don't you just let me respond without coaching me how to do it? Can we do that?
Okay, I'll give you 2 minutes. We'll go there.
Fine. The idea advanced by you earlier that you don't have one person walk away with $200 billion, roughly the estimate of Bezos's worth, and the vast majority of his employees unable to pay for their kids to go to college, is a distribution of the profits of that business that is morally reprehensible. That's how the wealth was accumulated, by the distributions of dividends to shares, share expansion and share improvement in value. We have a system that rewards one person with $200 billion and another one with $30,000. That's a remarkable decision to make in a community that calls itself democratic, or that likes to believe it wants to give people a fair and equal chance. No fairness here, no equality. It is revolting to me that anyone could find this reasonable. And to explain it by saying there's a demand, that's simply what the corporations give each other, the demand. They're the ones who create the demand, which they then fill with themselves, because they're the ones who hire each other for that job. It's a remarkable self-serving system where the folks at the top give themselves as much as they can get away with. And if it were looked at that way, it would not survive 10 minutes.
Wait, what was the original question?
We were comparing how we understand.
Wait, hold on.
We were asking how we react to that inequality.
No. The question was why. I asked you, why do you think Bezos is compensated so much more than a frontline employee? Do you think that the demand for those talents is equal between somebody that could be a CEO versus somebody that could work in a supermarket?
I don't think the demand for that talent is an explanation of anything. You'd have to explain why the demand is what it is. Who makes the demand?
Sure, I can. Yeah,
what?
We can talk about all of that. I would imagine you as a professor should know the answer to all these questions, right? Where is the demand to running a multi-billion-dollar company that turns profits for people that? I mean, like, you can explain all of these things. I don't know why you would pretend there's not answers. Very clear answers for all of these.
You can cast whatever aspersions you want on my qualification.
I'm not casting any aspersions on your qualifications.
Let's stick to the audience Q&A.
Sure.
We have a few more to get
it's
through.
It's disappointing that instead of getting an actual answer to anything, it was all moralized. That's all we had. But okay.
Destiny, let's stick to the Q&A, okay?
Sure.
All right. The next question, I believe, goes to you, Destiny. If you identify as a SOC Dem, why is it that you did not publicly support Bernie Sanders during his run?
I think that some of what Bernie Sanders advocates for goes in directions that I think would be detrimental to the economy. There were larger policies that he had. I don't know how I feel necessarily about a national jobs guarantee. I definitely don't like the push for like nationwide rent control. These are just certain types of. I don't know if the economy can handle like a 15 an hour federal minimum wage at the federal level. There were just a lot of policies that Bernie Sanders pushed for. I think at one point he pushed also for that plan for 20% of every business would be owned by workers. I don't know how the United States would manage that. And then his version of Medicare for all went like more extreme than any other version of socialized healthcare in the world. A lot of these things just pushed it way too far for me. I didn't think they were politically viable. I would have taken Bernie Sanders easily over Donald Trump, or probably a few of the other Democratic candidates, but I just felt like there were better middle grounds than what Bernie Sanders was pushing for.
Okay. To you, Professor Wolff, what is the best way to judge the success of an economic system such as capitalism or socialism?
Well, you know, there are many dimensions, many standards, many metrics that you can use. One of them is economic growth. The other one is the distribution of wealth and income that the society and the economic system generate. For me, I'm committed to asking the question whether the people who do the work, who pour their brains and their muscles into the production of goods and services, are or are not entitled to participate in deciding how those goods and services are distributed, how the income, if they're sold in markets, is distributed. I would like to see human beings have the right to participate democratically in the workplace. It is at least as important as participating democratically in the residential community where you live. We have the forms in the latter and the complete absence of it. So for me, a test of an economic system would be how much real democratic participation in both work and residential community life people are able to have. And on that ground, capitalism falls so far short that it's an easy choice.
Okay, to Destiny, under the current conditions of COVID and everything that's happened, as so many people seem to be suffering and it is stratified people between classes, how can you still defend capitalism?
I don't know. People seem
I believe, sorry, this one is specifically about the U.S. response. I think that
oh, yeah, sure. People like to attribute like so many strange ills. I noticed Professor did it earlier when he said our unemployment is very high right now. Like that's a fault of capitalism, and we're just ignoring the worldwide pandemic that's currently occurring. There are ways that our government right now can respond to the pandemic that don't require it to be a socialist government. There have been far more left-leaning governments in other countries that have failed to respond to the pandemic. You can look across the entirety of Europe for examples of that, if you wish. I think that these two things are totally disassociated from other. I think that it is possible to maintain a capitalist economy while also having adequate intervention from the government to alleviate the problems that we have with the pandemic, which we're starting to see under Biden. Unfortunately, it's taken a while, but even under Trump, we saw things like the CARES Act and whatnot as well.
Wait, let him keep speaking. He still has.
Oh no, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt him during my answer. Go ahead, Professor.
Yeah, I would respond in two ways. Number one, the United States has 4% of the world's population and 20% of the world's COVID deaths. For a rich country with a well-developed medical system, that is a systemic failure beyond all words. So for me, yeah, this is a problem of a system that could not prepare itself properly for a pandemic it knows could happen, given the one that we had a century ago and the many since that time. And it is likewise a system that was not able to cope very well with what it was unprepared for. The second and final thing I will say is I notice that there are three governments in the world right now, the United States, Brazil, and India, characterized by right-wing governments for most of the time of the pandemic, Trump here, Bolsonaro in Brazil, and Modi in India. Their performances, these three countries, of these three right-wing, super pro-capitalist leaders are among the worst in the world, more than pretty much every place else. And I think that speaks volumes to what's at stake in making this decision between the pro-capitalist and the pro-socialist.
I mean, just to be clear, the UK, Italy,
do you want to respond to that? I'll
Belgium.
give it a minute.
I mean, like, there are other countries that did worse than the United States, and then comparably, there are countries that also did.
That's an amazing standard to use.
Hey, wait. Let him finish.
There were some that were worse.
Yeah, wait, just let Destiny finish with his response. We'll do a 1 minute time, and then we can get a response back.
I mean, like, if you want to look at like the deaths per 1 million population, like a lot of countries around the world dropped the ball on this. Some did very well, and some of the ones that did very well are capitalist countries. You know, places like South Korea that have like heavily liberalized their economy are bastions of like capital success. Have done very, very well when it comes to tracking and dealing with this. You know, Australia and New Zealand are capitalist countries, and they also did very well countering this. Places like the United Kingdom that has socialized healthcare that provides education for its citizens, they had a worse deaths per million than the United States did. Again, I'm not saying that like, hooray, capitalism can save us or, you know, any of that stuff. I'm just saying that how your country did, I don't think is necessarily reliant on the organization that you have in your economy. I think it's more important to see what type of action does your government take, which I don't know, maybe Wolff has a definition of socialism where it's also the government coming in and intervening for diseases, but, you know, whether you have all worker co-ops or all privately managed firms, I don't see how that matters when it comes to how your country addresses coronavirus.
Could I respond?
Do you want a 1 minute response to that, and then we'll move on to the next question?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. At the beginning of this discussion, Steve rattled off about how socialist societies have never succeeded. So he generally equated the socialism with the success. I try to do that now in terms of the COVID response, and he takes exception. He doesn't want it to be so. He doesn't like the linking of the social system with the problem. Well, you really can't have it both ways. I didn't point out that socialism and capitalist countries had some general difference. I pointed out that the three of the worst examples of mass death happened in societies led by people on the extreme right. That leaves a big open space for the variety of other less extreme situations. That's the point of it all. Not that capitalism is the cause of everything, but that it contributes in ways that you can identify and trace.
Can I get a 5-second response to that?
Let's move on. Okay, fine.
A 5-second response. Go. I think that you would have an easier time blaming Chernobyl on socialism than you would the coronavirus response on capitalism. That's all I'm saying.
Exactly. It's exactly what you're saying. I see that.
Thank you.
Okay. Can we 2 more questions, gentlemen? Do we have time for that? Is that all right?
I got all the time in the world.
Okay. To Professor Wolff, worker cooperatives survive and thrive all over the world by the thousands. Why couldn't we build a stable, sustainable economy based on the bottom-up, democratically run cooperatives? Emulate that model here in the U.S. Why hasn't it taken off yet?
Well, there are many reasons. You know, capitalism, and I will apologize in advance for referring to feudalism and other systems, they not only take a long time to get going and to settle in, but when they do, one of the reasons they succeed is that they develop a culture, a politics that is consistent with, that is built so it reinforces the economic system upon which it sits. Capitalism is no different. If you begin to break down, as capitalism is now doing, and you see efforts, whether they're worker co-ops, or socialist movements, labor movements, and so on, beginning the slow construction of alternatives, they're going to encounter politics and culture that stand in the way, politics and culture that militate against it. I can't tell you the number of times I explain worker co-ops to people who really can't get their heads at first around, well, gee, how do they get money? Or how do they solve their problems? Or how do they grow? Because in their world, there has to be a boss. And the boss has to be, in other words, they have adjusted their own life expectations and understanding of how the world works to the way it is now. All of that is breaking down, but it takes time. And I think that's why you'll see that while worker co-ops have existed from the beginning, when the United States was even just a colony, why it takes a long time before the combination of breakdown of capitalism and the emergence of these alternatives gets up to speed so that people's political and cultural awarenesses allow them to flourish.
All right, final question to you, Destiny. Why do you never mention Vietnam, especially in relationship to how they handled COVID and their success in that area?
I don't know specifically why. I looked into, for all of my COVID debates, it was usually New Zealand, Australia, South Korea, and then on the flip side, places like the United States and the UK for examples of successfully handling the pandemic versus unsuccessfully handling it. In terms of, that's for the coronavirus stuff. In terms of like economic history, my understanding is that Vietnam tried their single party state. Labor unions can only exist under one party. They had a heavily socialized economy, but much like what existed in the USSR, people after their work shifts would have to spend time throughout the day engaging with like a shadow economy or kind of a black economy or a black market where they would have to buy and sell the goods that weren't otherwise available in their country. In Russia, they did this with a system, or in the USSR, they did this with a system of blats. I don't know if they've got a formal name for it in the Vietnamese economy, but it seems like the way that Vietnam has worked to kind of modernize their economy through, I think they're called I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, it's like the Doi Moi reforms, through all of these referendums they did in terms of bringing their economy more in line with being more successful. These have all involved the liberalization of their economy, the association with other economies around the world. And you could even see with some multilateral trade agreements like the TPP, outside pressure was actually forcing Vietnam to modernize on some of its labor rights. The Socialist Party of that country was not able to do it on its own. It needed some external association. And we can see that within countries, even socialist countries, that they still have massive problems with some of their populations. I mean, we can point to the Uyghur situation that exists in China as an example of what is supposedly a socialist country having a huge problem dealing with, equitable shares of how to treat people within its own borders.
All right, final question to you, Professor Wolff. Under your system of worker cooperatives, would I still get my PlayStation 5?
Absolutely. You'd have to struggle a little bit for it. You'd have to talk to your fellow workers. You'd have to talk about the distribution of income. You'd have to compare your desire for PlayStation against all the other interests of all the other people. It wouldn't be something you worked out on your own with your particular boss in any way. It would have to be a democratic decision. You'd have to come to terms with that the way you do with democratic decisions now in our society, to the extent that we have them. And I would like to add only that if Steve is interested, he could also look at the experience with COVID that the Cubans had, because it is in many ways even better than the ones that the Vietnamese had.
For the purposes of complete transparency, I'm just going to state that last question was actually my own. And now we'll move on to closing statements. We'll begin with Destiny, and then we will end with Richard Wolff. You have 3 minutes.
Oh, geez, I didn't write a closing statement. So at the end of this, I guess my important takeaway for all of this is I think that it is crucial not to moralize our economic systems. I think that when you start to moralize economic systems, what you forget is that an economic system is merely a tool. I don't want to ask a question of like, is a hammer good or evil? I want to ask, what is the best type of nail that you can hit with a particular hammer? When you begin to point out whether or not a particular economic system is in and of itself good or evil, then you lose sight of what economies are supposed to do, which is efficiently allocate capital or natural resources in ways that make a country as prosperous as possible. I do agree with Richard Wolff, and probably with every socialist or every left-leaning person around the world, that there are a ton of problems that exist in the Western world, and more specifically in the United States today, relating to things like inequality, social justice, lack of access to things like healthcare or education, or basic things like food stamps or shelter, or other like basic necessities. I just don't see how a socialist society solves literally any of these things. And I don't feel like I've ever been given an adequate explanation by any socialist for how they would organize their society. Usually these arguments are incredibly amorphous or vague, such that literally everything is socialism. Like, you can still have private enterprise and co-ops, and the government does some things, and voila, that's socialism, which just sounds like liberalism to me, with government intervention, which is liberalism. Or they try to make arguments for more strict forms of socialism, but I think that it's hard to get them to admit that in those stricter forms of socialism, they would disallow things like private investment. And I guess it bothers me because so many innovations and things have existed only under the framework of capitalism that even with public research and public pushing, you weren't able to get. For instance, I believe the LED was discovered or was invented in Russia like 100 years ago. And it wasn't until Western private enterprise took a hold of that invention and started utilizing it that anybody was able to actually enjoy the invention.
All right, thank you. And now Professor Wolff, closing statements. You have 3 minutes.
Sure. I think it's very hard for people to break out of the straitjacket that capitalism, having existed for 300 years, imposes on us, often unconsciously, often through the medium of our parents, our teachers, and so forth. I respect that. That's difficult. Human beings have a hard time doing that. I'm included. But I think that what is unique here is that all those problems of American capitalism that Steve just listed, the difference is whether you see those as distinct problems that you, as a good liberal, think that the government could address or that some institutional adjustment could address. People who have looked at the inequalities, the instability, the injustices of capitalism have tried that for a long time, and it doesn't work. The fact of the matter is we have more inequality now than we had 10, 40, and 60 years ago. That's the system that we live in. It's as though what the liberal does is look for every possible explanation other than that the basic system is the problem and system change is the solution. And one last effort to clarify, since it seems murky for Steve. The difference I advocate is a radical transformation of the workplace so that the person who comes to work is no longer overwhelmingly an employee, a drone, told where to sit and what to do with what machine on what occasion, and then at the end of the day is told, go home. What happens to what you helped to produce is none of your business. That transforming that into a collective community that democratically decides so that every worker has 2 job descriptions, the particular task and your equal participation in running, designing, and organizing the enterprise. That is a liberation of human capability. It is a transformation of life from the bottom up and represents a kind of socialism which, were it to be achieved, would be a control on the government so it does what the people need and not get shifted off to other things that sustain the state as against the people. That's a lesson learned from the earlier socialisms that the newer socialisms have incorporated. The mass of people will determine, as capitalism, especially in the United States, declines, whether, when, and how to move forward. But the yearning to do better than we're doing in U.S. capitalism, that's already a fact. It's now only a question where it'll go. The very fact that this conversation is happening and that someone like me was invited to participate is itself a sign of where things are going.
All right. Thank you so much for participating in this on both parts. Would either of you like to plug any of your current social projects or what you have going on?
I'm good.
Okay, Richard?
All I would say, if anyone is interested in the kinds of things I have to say, we maintain a website, democracyatwork.info. From there, you can find everything that we do. Very simple.
All right. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Well, how about that? Oh my God. Okay. Let me know if I'm audible.
Jesus. Where the good interlocutors at? I feel like I've gotten really lucky on my stream because I think we've
Why is that still playing? Okay, there we go. All right, well, that was something. Oh, man. That was exhausting. Here, let's get some chess going and then we'll chat about this absolute catastrophe of a debate, quote unquote. I think Wolff did very well. Okay, how do I... Right, okay, so 0, 0, nah, we'll go 20 there. I just discovered how to crop today, so that's awesome. Okay, oh, there we go, no, 200, boom, there we go, okay, cool. And then, let's do 100, let's do 90, 85, and let's do 100, cool. And we'll just zoom that up, and we'll get rid of that. Yeah. That was really bad. I think Wolff did well. Nope, sorry, whoever that was. I think Wolff did well, but I don't think he was doing enough to point out the actual problems with Destiny's approach, which was very one-sided. So Destiny seemed to be committed to arguing about socialism as if it was simply a different set of policies within a capitalist framework, and he was simply incapable of addressing, at the conceptual level, actual like structural change over time, which was an additional factor. So he would ask like it's a contradiction, like, well, you have these different sorts of class relations coexisting. Well, I mean, that's sort of obvious if your theory implicates a historical change over time. I'm not very well read on socialist writings, and I know this, so it's a little bit strange that Wolff didn't like really hammer him on that point, because it seems to me that the problem with Steve's whole approach in that debate was that he couldn't think outside of he couldn't think the problem without naturalizing precisely what was under discussion. And the debate ended up not really being capitalism versus socialism at all. It ended up being, again, like within capitalism, are social co-ops viable? Which, again, like Wolff was arguing for as like a baby step towards socialism in the absence of any ability to actually like achieve real structural socialism. But that's all it was. It's a band-aid, so it's, I don't know. This was kind of a disaster. I'm thoroughly convinced that in terms of actually arriving at any sort of true understanding of anything, I mean, you can have positive debates. I was actually watching one with Perspective Philosophy and Cosmic Skeptic the other day. It was really good. I'm being butchered at chess here, but I'm distracted, so I'm okay. It was bad. That was really bad. Tetra asks, President Sunday, what do you think Wolff's goal for this convo was? I think Wolff was planning on having a sincere conversation. I think I got the sense that he was a little bit flustered early on. Because Destiny was engaging in an extremely, like, not to be like ageist or anything, but Wolff isn't a young guy, and Destiny's opening response was just a deluge of, I can't even remember a fraction of it. All I remember is the one that stuck out, which again would probably trigger Wolff, has to do with socialism failing, quote unquote, whatever that means. I was a little bit iffy with Wolff when he was talking about when he was construing the fact that what am I saying here? Sorry, I'm so wired after watching that. When he was talking about how it was thanks to socialism that all this private investment into China and Russia that made them so prosperous was able to take place, was that was the result of industrialization achieved by socialism. I was really iffy about that simply because he doesn't mention the monumental amount of death that incurred. It didn't necessarily have to incur that amount of death. Like, it could have been done more gradually, and there were other factors, of course, especially in the Chinese case, where it wasn't simply a matter of let them die. We're just going to like power forward. It's sort of like with COVID. Like, Xi Jinping didn't plan to have the virus released or order people to be silent about it in Wuhan. There were interests in Wuhan and around areas of the outbreak that that there were people who had a vested interest in keeping that a secret. So it's like, that's not a weakness of the form of government that China has. I mean, it might be at some level, but that's not like a weakness of the political theory that informs how China runs. That's a particular problem involving specific people, specific conditions, like levels of corruption within a system, things like that. This was really bad. Anyway. Russia and China's industrialization occurred under an ostensibly socialist government, but it was motivated in response to a global capitalist context. Stalin industrialized to face the capitalist West. Okay, so yeah, this is one thing that I really dislike about people who use this "we've tried socialism and it failed" argument. Wolff didn't really hammer this in an effective way, but he was making a very good point when he was like, look, socialism is very diverse. Why that's important is because, like, when we say that, like, for example, the USSR failed, so socialism failed, well, no. No more so than if you would say that, well, capitalism fails categorically because of the US's response to COVID. That's a particular case with its own particular characteristics that are contingency. That's the word I'm looking for. That situation represents a series of contingencies specific to the USSR, and not just specific to the USSR in terms of like the historical events that took place. The theory that governed the decisions of the revolutionary government in its earlier, more idealist phase was itself a radical departure from Marx. So, like, again, like, it's like, here's a question. The LRA is Christian, right? It's the Lord's Resistance Army. Does that invalidate? Is that like some sort of metaphysical argument against the existence of God? No. Does that invalidate the positives, the positive features of Christianity or of other religions on societies? No. It's a contingent case. Novinsik in Hosik, sorry if I mispronounced that, asks, Sunday Destiny has a reply to that, and you may not like it. If you allow me, I can give you the link. A reply to what? I mean, sure. I probably won't like it. Master Cheesy asks, would you call yourself a socialist or just vaguely left-wing? I'd say vaguely. I wouldn't even say necessarily left-wing. Not because I have any sort of like opposition to being characterized as left-wing. I have characterized myself as being effectively left-wing in the past, but just because I'm not clear what substantive claims I'm willing to commit myself to that I implicitly do by calling myself left-wing. I don't know if that makes sense. That was an odd way to phrase that. But I would say generally politically I fall fairly left-wing. I think a big problem with this debate was just the limited amount of time they had to discuss the issues. Like, this is, I mean, we didn't not just get a definition agreed upon for what socialism and capitalism are, that we could actually see a debate on the merits of socialism qua socialism and capitalism qua capitalism. We had I don't even know what to call this. Like, at the end of the day, what were they even arguing about? And if Destiny is convinced that socialism as a concept is so amorphous, then why agree to a debate that implicates the term itself specifically? Like, that's a little weird. If I like, I would never put myself into a debate against somebody who's, I don't know, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but like, when the title of the debate itself implies a statement that you can't that you don't endorse, or that you think is factually inaccurate. So, for example, the existence of socialism as a coherent policy such that you can debate its merits or demerits. Like, it's you're setting it up to be a gong show right out the gate. Horizonberg asks, what do you think would be the best starting definitions of socialism and capitalism for a fruitful discussion of those entities? Well, I mean, as a start, maybe even, like, get an agreed upon sense of the kind of thing that socialism and capitalism are, or if they are indeed alternatives. Because, like, when Wolff was outlining his definitions of socialism, Socialism 1 was just government regulation of business with sort of a socialist ethos dictating what those regulations are, or what those interventions are. Socialism 2 was government ownership of business with the structure remaining identical. And Socialism 3 was a total restructuring of production. He sort of waffled between production simply, the structure of society, the workday, etc. But, like, those first two, and Steve was actually correct to point this out, like, these don't really represent an alternative to capitalism such that you would have an argument. Is this preferable to capitalism? These would simply be sort of socialistic policies in capitalism. Now, I mean, Wolff asserted that he was on... Wolff said explicitly that he was advocating for Socialism 3, which is the total restructuring of society, of the workday, of how work works. But without either of them being willing to sort of fix on even, like, the kind of thing that it was. Like, is it a form of government? Is it a process? Is it an ethos? Is it... like, I don't actually know what capitalism is based on either of these people. Because you can flip that right back to Steve, right? Like, if both of these people are using definitions that are entirely compatible, that make what they're arguing entirely compatible with each other, such that you can't even really viably conceive of them as alternatives. I don't know. It seemed like everybody lost the plot from Go. So if I were to give a definition, I think Wolff was putting his finger on something important, not to be, like, condescending to him. He obviously knows what he's talking about, but when he was really getting into how you can have different class structures coexisting with each other, because, again, like, the switch from capitalism to socialism, on his view, wouldn't simply be like a one-to-one change of policies at a single moment. It would be like a gradual process. So my tendency would be to regard socialism as a conjectured process of history wherein the material conditions shift from one form to another over time, whereas capitalism seems to refer to something more static. So capitalism, even in Marxist theory, does also emerge in history, but because socialism is prospective, there's more of a concrete temporal element there, because you aren't talking about something that, whatever the explanation is, it simply must happen in the future. You're talking about something, whatever the explanation is of it, it has already happened, so we know it's a given. We're talking about something that has to be justified as almost an historical event. So my tendency would be to regard socialism as a process, as a what's the word I'm looking for? As a speculative process, we'll say, and capitalism as a static state of affairs that we can sort of describe in robust terms. One of the reasons why we're sort of forced into being ambiguous with our definitions of the particulars of socialism is that that prospective nature of it means that we actually don't have an empirical basis for a lot of what that will look like. It's a whole lot of guesswork. I'm so losing this game. I'm going to look through a few more questions and I'm going to call it. Yeah. Sam Kinney, I've asked this earlier this stream, but I'd like to re-ask it now that you're looking at chat. Why is it so important that we think about socialism in terms of processes instead of policy? It's important that we look at socialism in terms of processes, as well as in terms of policy, because socialism isn't just a form of government that you can swap in for any other. It implicates a concrete change in the structure of society over time. So it's not just an alternative state of affairs to capitalism, it is also an historical process. So one of the reasons why Steve seemed really confused during the debate was that he couldn't conceive of antagonistic class structures coexisting in a place at the same time. But that isn't really a problem if what you're describing is just a gradual shift, right? Like, obviously that's what would happen. So what am I gonna do? I'm so dead. So yeah, so it's not so much that we can only view socialism as a process. It's just that we also need to view socialism as a process. Otherwise, we're misunderstanding something really critical. I hope that makes sense. No Vince in Hossack says, President Sunday, I disagree that it's a guesswork because we can abstract the current system and restructure it. We can already predict it from a very present. Yeah, but that wouldn't be that wouldn't be an empirical empirically based prediction, right? I mean, you could incorporate empirical observations, but that would be a purely theoretical. A purely theoretical prediction, which is fine. Like, I don't think you can't make good guesses. It's just that you'd lack sort of the intuitive certainty of an empirical judgment, right? Commander 3 asks, President Sunday, what about public versus private property as a distinction for what is socialist versus capitalist? It depends on what you mean. The critical thing for the reason why socialists care about private property is because there's a limited amount of it, and capitalism allows individuals to monopolize productive property, or the kind of property that is required to engage in any sort of productive activity. So, like, for example, socialism wouldn't be particularly concerned with whether or not people can own a plot of land on which to have a house. It would be more concerned with whether or not people have the capacity to, whether or not, let's say, like something like farmland, or something like large plots of land required for manufacture, whether or not these things are, held by a minority of people or not. Because it's not just like an antagonism to any form of ownership. It's specifically the ownership of property that is required for production. All right, that was grueling. I think I'm going to call it a night. Well, thanks everybody for watching somebody else's stream that I put notes on. I'll upload those to the server. I don't think there's any rhyme or reason to it. That was a nightmare to try and annotate. It seemed like arguments were... I mean, Destiny had like a structure at the beginning, and then it just kind of got completely abandoned. And it's not difficult to see why, and it's not Wolff's fault. Like, he... like, Wolff talked for longer, but Destiny still managed to say more, and not in terms of quality, like in terms of the depth of what he was saying, but just, like, who could respond to that? Like, I was trying to write stuff down. I couldn't even keep track of it. How the hell is Wolff supposed to follow that? And he actually did fairly well, I think. But, yeah. Alright, well, as always, thanks for suffering with me. We'll be back on Saturday to go over King Crocoduck's video, what is that called? The Naturalist Nuke, or something against social construction of science. That'll be more fun than this, I hope. Take care, everybody.